Okay, thank you all for staying until the last day, and it has been a real pleasure, a very inspiring conference for me, and I hope also for you. Seeing a lot of interesting groups discussing science, various aspects of this climate-human evolution nexus was something that really gave me a deep satisfaction. And I hope also that this community stays together and that we can forge more synergy and also collaborations, and we'll have our collaboration cafe later on. These are just a few snapshots from the last days, and you will all recognize yourself and your colleagues. Let's see, this is our group snapshot. I think some of you still need to learn how to do the Korean heart. Some of the hearts don't look very professional yet, but that's something for the next time, for the next Busan conference. Then I wandered off into the woods and saw this interesting species there. So maybe a new species, Homo bangudensis, and you wonder what are they pointing at? Why is this group pointing to this side and the other one to this one, except Kelvin Richards standing there steadfast in the middle, not being manipulated by the person on the other side. So I wonder what are they pointing to? Maybe models and data, but the key point is, of course, this group is together and can talk to each other. And so I think we have made great effort in this conference to really bridge the theoretical and the modeling as well as the empirical data community, archaeologists, anthropologists, and paleoclimate scientists. Okay, and geneticists, of course. So let me start with a few closing remarks. They were all scrambled together quite late and quite early, so I'm not quite sure if I can still make sense out of my slides. You will see what's going to happen. So one of the fundamental questions that we addressed here was why are we who we are and why we are, and what role did climate play? And this is almost like a Hamletian question to address, and it's a big question, and it will probably take many more scientists and conferences and papers to really make major progress on many of these aspects of the fundamental question. So here are some of the main protagonists that we talked about. I've excluded the mammals right now that we also had the pleasure of hearing about, but we had several Homo species that were the target of our discussions. And I think this is a kind of the Anthropocene, just spelled differently. And the question is, what does climate have to do with all of this? Of course, this is a bit like an opera. These two groups coexist. They have some interaction. Maybe there are some love stories, as we heard from Zhao Yang Run, between Denisovans and Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So there is a little bit of an opera plot going on. So what does climate have to do with this? So climate in some way, every once in a while, throws some interesting challenges to our protagonists. And this is essentially the conductor that has a magic button to synchronize the stories, to conduct the stories and direct the stories into particular directions. And it doesn't mean that without the conductor these groups would not be able to interact. Still they would do, but climate in some way is a synchronizer to the entire dynamics of our human species. And that's what we set out to really investigate and quantify in this conference. Okay, so, well, there is only one species left. It's a pretty boring opera. Everybody else dies, but that's also a part of the whole beauty of this evolutionary history that we try to understand. Okay, here again a slide from my introduction where we see the overall context. Climate has been cooling with a major transition in the periodicity from the pre-mid-Pleistocene transition to the post-MPT world, where we have 40,000 years switching into 80 to 120,000 years. And a lot of things happened. We had several speciations, maybe even some bottlenecks. The brain size of our genus increased dramatically, and we have also changes in the culture, as we saw in this procedural unit counts that was introduced earlier on. So looking at just this, there is no evidence that climate is actually really driving things. The causality is not really clear. And to establish and quantify the causality, I think this is a really important challenge that we need to address further on. And I will give you some ideas on how we can go about this in future. And well, sure, of course, we're not only looking at the biological evolution of our genus, but we're also looking at the cultural evolution. And the interesting thing is, of course, the cultural evolution drives the biological evolution and the other way around as well. So, let's see, sorry, I think I skipped one. Okay, if we think about, let's say, the causality in this climate-human nexus story, we had several interesting discussions. We have the Milankovitch cycles. I should actually be moving here once more. There we go. Okay, obliquity, eccentricity, precession, changing the insolation on our planet, changing the seasonality and the spatial gradients, which generates changes in temperature as well as precipitation patterns. And that leaves an imprint on climate and, of course, also vegetation. And we heard talks by Elke and others to illustrate that vegetation is really responding to these astronomical Milankovitch forcings. And at the same time, of course, we have also other ecosystems responding to these shifts in vegetation, and these would be animals, for instance. And much of the vegetation and animal changes will also influence the food resources and the carrying capacity. And we heard an interesting talk by Mika Talavara, who pledged or who advocated for introducing more realistic carrying capacity calculations. So this is really crucial because many of the models that we are running essentially make some assumption on food availability, food or resource availability. So this magic term carrying capacity is something that we need to fill with more contents, with more flesh. And of course, well, if food is available, that's fine. If it's not fine. So anyways, these switches in the Earth's climate and food resources can then drive shifts in migration, potentially adaptation, or if it's unsuccessful, it could lead to extirpation or extinction. It really influences our survival and also potentially speciation because we are dealing with a diverse population to begin with. Then if there is some kind of adaptation to these climatic challenges or resource availability challenges, then, well, maybe we can also develop better cultural tools. Sorry, I could only find the hammer. There was no spare and arrow in the Apple computer. So this is indicative of just techno-complexes that we are developing that will help us to obtain more resources or more easily or efficiently. So this could become almost like a positive feedback. The more resources we have available through tool development, the more people will be around, which also leads to better cultural development. So we are cultural learners. So in a larger group, we have more recombinations of knowledge and innovation. And that can essentially become a pretty treacherous feedback loop. And currently we are in this feedback loop, which means we are exploiting our resources. And this is the world of the Anthropocene. And the human agency on our geosphere is something that has become very apparent. And we are to some extent not only influencing the ecosystems around us, but we're also influencing and depleting other resources on our planet. And this is, of course, the concept of planetary boundaries. So these are limiting factors, if you like. So these are negative feedbacks in the system because they will negatively influence our carrying capacity and our population size. So this is a pretty interesting spiral. It took 2 or 3 million years in our planet to really have this cultural development go completely on steroids. And right now we are in this situation where food availability without cultural tools would not be possible. Okay, so this is just an illustration, and I showed this earlier on, showing this combination, this nexus, climate and human evolution is an interesting case where we can bring together a lot of different disciplines, and you're all here in this room because you represent different disciplines. Of course, paleoclimate we talked about, paleobiology, archaeology, anthropology, genomics, and also, in principle, in order to understand human evolution, I mentioned we need to understand cultural evolution. We also, in principle, need to have behavioral scientists on board for our discussions. So cultural evolution is really manifested in the data that we have in the archaeological record, but it's also a booster of a lot of the adaptation that happened and the responses and the build-up of resilience to climatic stress. Okay, so this is, as I said in the beginning, a really amazing research opportunity also for larger research projects. Let's say Horizon Europe is a fantastic venue for submitting projects on this merger of these different disciplines. And I wanted to come back to some of the talks that we had and some of the key research questions that were indicated and suggested. So let's start with climate variability. We heard about Milankovitch cycles, Ayako talked about Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles. The seasonal cycle is of course important because that is modulated by Milankovitch cycles. Volcanic eruptions were mentioned by Mike Petraglia, tipping points by Ricarda, asteroid impacts by Landai, and global warming in some way by Gilles in the last talk, but also by Ralf Grebe. So these are all, let's say, climatic stresses that leave an impact on the ecosystems. The interesting thing is we don't know much about ecological tipping points. We know, for instance, corals have a coral bleaching threshold. It's a temperature. If you exceed that one, the zooxanthellae from the coral polyp will be expelled. The polyp essentially bleaches, doesn't get any sugars, and it can die if it lasts for too long. So there are very clear temperature thresholds. Humans is a bit more complicated because we don't know. Well, we have certain temperature thresholds, I suppose, but we are perhaps not reaching them, at least not in the paleoclimate record. But still, the availability of food is really important. So in order to understand how humans respond, we need to understand how the food systems actually respond to climatic stress. We talked about bottlenecks, potential bottlenecks. Is it possible that any of these extreme climatic events could trigger a bottleneck in human populations or maybe in the food resources? This is something that needs to be explored further. We are, I think, right now at the very beginning, and Kronis gave a talk about a situation where the lack of food resources potentially, at least as manifested in the vegetation record, could have even led to extirpation or extinction in some areas. The interesting aspect is then if you have a climatic stress occurring and you have two groups and one group is more adapted than another group, then the more adapted group can really play its competitive advantage much more dramatically. So climatic stress could also be an accelerator, a booster for competitive differences. And one concept that was not mentioned but that's very useful in this discussion is climate velocity. If you look at, let's say, a temperature isotherm on our planet, let's say 10 degrees Celsius isotherm, and you have a climate shift, that isotherm moves with a certain velocity. And if you are adapted to this isotherm range, and you cannot catch up with this movement, with a velocity, you have to either die or adapt. However, if the movement, the climate velocity is so slow that you and your future generations can easily cope with this, let's say on Milankovitch cycles, then this is not really a stressor. It is something that will generate habitat movements essentially, and what we can call habitat tracking. So climate velocity is a really nice tool that we can also quantify, not only in climate models, but also vegetation models, but also in real observational data. Okay, so related things are, we don't really have a clear answer on how humans will respond. What are really the drivers for adaptation and selection? And this is climate stress and the way we deal with climate stress. Climate stress can be beautifully expressed through this climate velocity concept. Okay, let's look at this lower part. Climate has also been invoked as a driver, as an important player in some of the main selections that occurred in the last 3 million years. And that was illustrated in the variability selection hypothesis of Rick Potts and others. or the Red Queen or pulse climate scenarios, for instance by Maslin. He has a very nice, Mark Maslin has a very nice summary summary presentation about this in one of his review papers. And then of course migration and allopatric speciation. So climate kind of enters here, but how this happens actually, let's say quantitatively, mathematically, is not clear. Do we have real evidence from the data that variability selection, for instance, works? Testing this is not trivial. So we are essentially dealing with interesting ideas, but they are not on the level that we can really quantitatively test them and either reject them with a certain confidence or not. So in particular, the variability selection hypothesis, I'm a bit skeptical about it. We saw that actually the moment you allow, it's a zero-dimensional idea, the moment you allow for spatial dimension, that variability selection hypothesis, at least from a mathematical point of view, disappears. So there are a lot of fundamental questions that we can still address in future regarding this climate aspect. Now, concepts, of course, these are big words here for evolutionary biologists, I suppose. Species, I mean, what's a species? Is a Denisovan a species? We don't know yet. And dispersal, of course, we have better understanding of that one. Speciation, as I mentioned earlier, is not that clear. Origin versus habitat. We saw, I think Mike also pointed to Eleanor Scarry's paper, Cherry, right? Cherry's paper. And where the discussion is brought forward about multi-regional origins. Actually, if we look at that paper more clearly, it is more about multi-regional habitats in some way and the way different regions communicate. So that in a fragmented world, and whether each of these different regions contributes to our own DNA today is another question. So testing also this habitat versus multi-regional origin is an interesting research question. Okay, then adaptation selection. Adaptation is rather easy to show in the record to climatic conditions. We heard from Pasquale Raya, the invention of leather shoes and all these cold protective gear that our ancestors developed. That's something that's very clear. Or the moment we earlier ancestors were able to control fire is a key point where you see major changes, cultural changes and behavioral changes seeing, and in particular the climate niche expands also then into colder regions. So there are aspects that are easy to further research and others that are less straightforward. Okay, so area of origin, the origin question was brought forward. There are actually statistical tools that allow you to determine, using phylogenetic information and maybe proxy data, fossil data or specimen data to determine areas of origin. And the concept is, well, you can have a different area of origin. Let's say if we looked at our human species, let's say we looked at the area of origin of all the Eurasians 60,000 years ago. Well, it would be somewhere maybe in Northern Africa and the Levant. If we look 200,000 years ago, it might be a different area. If we look 2 million years ago, it would be another area. So this concept of origin has to be connected, has to be linked to time horizon. And usually we do that by linking it to a time horizon that corresponds to a speciation event. And this is a bit lost in the literature so far, that actually there are real mathematical tools to determine these areas of origins for a particular species, speciation time horizons. Well, we have a big issue, of course. All the data sets are very sparse, so we most likely need to use phylogenetic imputation, making some assumptions on daughter or parent species, their habitats, their behavior, and so on. That's the only way to kind of extend the data set for mathematical and quantitative analysis further to address these concepts. And well, paleoanthropology, of course, is a amazing field that has benefited tremendously from this paleogenomic perspective. And I think these two fields are now really working in tandem together to really inform each other, but they have very different tools. And really understanding the tools on both sides is absolutely crucial in order to make solid conclusions about human evolution. Okay, I'll move to the next one. Okay, well, apart from these big concepts, of course, we are not dealing with homogeneous populations. At any point in time, most likely, at least for Homo sapiens, we have rather scattered, fragmented populations. So what really matters if we want to understand interactions amongst these populations, genetic diversification or mixing, is to better understand the fragmentation or the connectivity between these groups, or to understand where there might be refugia. And so all of this is essentially the spatiotemporal complexity of our human ancestors that will give us a clue on how evolution actually shaped, or how climate may have shaped human evolution. And climate is a key driver in contributing to these fragmentation processes, to the dynamics of refugia and green corridors and the connectivity. So understanding this is really important, and I think we are just about to make some progress in terms of understanding spatial-temporal complexity, let's say over different regions during the glacial, interglacial time periods. All right, so well, I'll come back to that later. Okay, so classification is another one. So if you think about the A sapiens, of course, you can create also an A neanderthalensis or an A heidelbergensis from that. And anybody who has been to the Vienna Museum of Culture, of History, Natural History, should go. They have a little emulator there. You can take a photo and create yourself a heidelbergensis face. So these seems very straightforward. But of course, if we look at it from a genetic point of view, there are no major transitions. Genetically, we are evolving slowly and gradually, where there is a mutation here, there is a mutation there. So essentially, somewhere in between, we are all hybrids. It just means that we look at hybrids pretty far away. That gives us some kind of coarse graining of our species concept. So species concept is a bit more of a gradual gray zone idea that makes us easier to classify things. But are these classifications really necessary, in particular when we model evolution, or should we rather think about the human species, the human genus as a continuum? So these are just some thoughts on this classification. Phylogeny is of course quite helpful, but if you look at just the phylogenetic tree from, let's say, mitochondrial DNA, it looks very, very complicated, and so there is nothing where you can say, okay, this is a species. If you look at it in a very fine scale. If you have a lot of genetic data available, it will be very difficult to really isolate different species unless they have already been strongly speciated. So, but there is always a continuum in between. Okay, something similar also, I mean, should we look at human evolution from a subpopulation size, more regional? That would make sense because we are looking more at archaeological excavation sites, so there is always a regional aspect where we have high data coverage. But or should we look at, let's say, Homo heidelbergensis as a metapopulation? What is the proper regional, let's say, truncation of this continuum? That's not clear at all. What is really the important, let's say, regional coarse graining that we need to do, or fine graining, in order to understand evolutionary processes? Well, and then there is a question about lumping versus splitting, and I've had many discussions with other scientists about this. Lumping versus splitting is it really necessary to introduce new species names, like was suggested Homo bodaensis? Does it give us any new insight, or is it more like a show off of certain individuals that really want to go for particular names? I think this, whenever we introduce new names, we really have to think about, does it really change our deeper understanding of the dynamical processes? For Denisovans, that could be an interesting one. So, of course, there was this discussion, is there a Homo denisova or Homo denisovensis? I'm not quite sure what even the proper word would be. But so, of course, it doesn't exist yet. We only have Denisovans, but the species name is not clear because we don't have any real fossil that we can assemble completely skeleton for. So the question then is the same. Should we simulate species or continuums when we think about the mathematical aspect of it? And also, well, what about ghost populations? Can these be individual species which we don't have any names for yet? So the whole thing is very confusing, and also if you read anthropological papers, there is always some discussion about the species naming. But from a side that I take from the outside, how can we really look at this complexity, the different groups? What would be the best way to model it? I wonder if we should spend too much time on naming things. But this is just my personal view. Well, what is a species? Anyways, there are, I suppose, many different definitions. One of them being, of course, that there is no interbreeding. So, but we know Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. So this is always an interesting gray zone to consider. Okay, now we have this phylogenetic complexity, but then also we have processes, in particular if two groups come together. Zhao Yang talked about the love story between Denisovans and Neanderthals. So we are starting to dilute different groups, populations, and maybe species. That hybridization, of course, was beautifully demonstrated in Vivian Sloan's paper with the discovery of Denny, and Katerina Duca was involved, Tom. Ambiguity of technocomplexes is something related to that. So let's suppose we have a different or groups coming together, and I think maybe Mike, you also showed something regarding this. Different groups, essentially, or Tom, I think, coming together, interbreeding. What would be the dominant lithics that we would find there? Would that be a mixture of two different types of lithics, or do they develop a new one? That's totally unclear. If we see Mousterian cultures, is that necessarily related to Neanderthals, in particular in an area where a lot of interbreeding or interaction at least took place? I think in particular in these transition time periods we need to open up our view to reinterpret, also be a bit more ambiguous regarding the interpretation of technocomplexes. Okay, so simulating interbreeding, we had some discussion about that. A habitat overlap as a proxy for interbreeding, that's, I think, an interesting idea that with these habitat models we can see when and where the different groups overlap. We can do this for the musk ox, we can do this for other bovines and so on, and for other Homo species. This tells us something about interactions. Potential for interbreeding, but also potential for competition. And this is something to further elaborate on. Okay, so I'm probably running out of time. I wanted to say a few words about this past climate reconstructions, which was more the climate context part of the first 2 days, where we had many insightful talks about speleothem-based climate reconstructions, and Hubert had some fascinating data he shared with us. Daniel, and then marine sediments, Kronis showed some absolutely amazing high-resolution data that go back into MRS 34. So these are tools that allow us now to finally derive quantitative physical climate data. We can extract from speleothems a real temperature. It's not like delta 18O, maybe temperature, maybe precipitation. We have real paleothermometry tools. And this is a really fascinating field, because in future, when excavations are done in caves and you have speleotherms, by hopefully chance and luck, lying around, you have the possibility to really bring these things together and build habitat suitability or climate niche models, not with climate data, but with real on-site data. And I think this will be a game changer. And I think speleotherms will play an important role, but you can also build habitat suitability models using other proxy data, for instance, pollen data. You can build a direct, rather than using temperature and precipitation, you could use the percentage of quercus or pinus or something like this to build essentially empirical habitat models with real empirical on-the-ground paleoclimate data. Okay, so this is a huge new challenge, but I think it requires a lot of data to be assembled, but this is something for the future, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years. Well, we had several discussions on dating. Ineke introduced us to uranium lead dating. River showed some amazing examples of how you can use uranium thorium dating, and he also opened not only his vast collection of wonderful photos to us for everybody to share, and we're going to send a link to you, but he also invited people to collaborate with him. And I think this openness of the colleagues working on dating is very, very important to boost this field and accelerate the field. Okay, well, there are still some challenges sometimes for some of the proxies. Let's say you have marine sediment cores, you need to make some assumptions about seasonality. And well, there is another thing here that I wanted to mention, and that's what I call the Holocene challenge. It's not the Holocene conundrum, which is about the trends, it's a Holocene challenge. If you take different paleoclimate records, and I think we had a few of them for the Holocene, you look at them, okay, none of them really seems to match with each other. I mean, are we looking at regional climatic noise, or are we looking at highly uncertain reconstructions? Or is it just that on Holocene timescales we don't have any large-scale climate fluctuations to take care of? So these are important questions. Whenever I look at papers with Holocene paleoclimate records, of course the eye is immediately trying to see what really fits, but very often this match is quite weak. And one of the best examples is this elusive 4.2 kiloyear event. I think it was mentioned by Dong Hee, right? 4.2. Well, it's all over the internet, and nobody knows really what it is. If you take some records, you see it, and you take a record from 500 kilometers away, there is no evidence for it. So it's extremely elusive, and we are cherry pickers. Maybe this is also something that was important from our evolutionary point of view. We like to see patterns, and so you can discard 10 paleoclimate records that don't have a 4.2K event and show only 2 or 3 that have. It looks convincing. So we have to be very careful with some of these events, because we like to, also evolutionary aspect, we like to convey narratives. A very powerful narrative if you have an event, some asteroid impact or so. So dealing with these events that occurred in the Holocene needs to be done very, very carefully. And I think we have to all step back here and not just perpetuate, let's say, paradigms that haven't been fully tested. Okay, building empirical niche models. I think this is a nice outcome that I got from this conference, that soon we will be able to replace paleoclimate model data in niche models with real data from Hubert and others. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, linking the direct environmental data with archaeological evidence will be the future. Okay, and then we had our oracle, Christoph, saying something that really stuck with me. Models are cultural objects. And still ringing in my ears. I'm not quite sure what to make out of it, but it sounded really deep. So anyways, what does it mean? Let's talk about climate models. And several techniques were introduced. The paleo snapshot simulations, let's say LGM or let's say mid-Holocene, and we had several examples. Then we had these concatenated snapshot simulations that I think were used in some earlier work. Then we have transient modeling. Ayako showed some transient modeling, and we had some talks today. The Muskox talk showed a habitat model that was driven by the trace transient simulation, glacial, interglacial. And then also Landai introduced this asteroid impact modeling. So we have interesting tools where we can look at either a snapshot very accurately with many different models, Plio was mentioned by Gilles, or we can look at the transit trajectory in response to certain forcings or particular events. Okay, so now in order to bring these models back into the realm of real data, fortunately over the last maybe 10-15 years, the community also developed isotope enabled models, and what you can see here is a study by Nitesh Sinha, which is currently still working on it, where you can see this is the dominant precessional scale pattern of delta 18O over Eastern Asia, and you can see actually over Korea. Korea is almost in a nodal line, so even though in China you have very strong precessional variability in your delta 18O, in Korea you may not have anything, or in Japan even the opposite direction. So this is important. We need to understand the patterns. We cannot just assume delta 18O on our planet goes up and down everywhere the same way. So this is crucial, and I think the early studies on climate and human evolution, they showed these, let's say, iconic records, Lisiecki and Ramo 04 or North Grip or something like this, which very often have absolutely nothing to do with the real target. So there were papers that showed Lisiecki and Ramo record in comparison with Eastern African sites. And no, Eastern African climate is much more dominated by the precessional cycle. There is no precessional cycle in Lisiecki and Ramo stack. So we need to understand the patterns, and that's really crucial. And for that, I think these isotope-enabled models are extremely useful. Okay, then this now allows us to directly compare climate models with speleothem data because they often show variations in the isotopes. We can learn something about the atmospheric circulation, and also I talked to someone about, I think Sarah, about enamel isotopes. So the teeth have different isotopes which we can use to understand what kind of water people or animals were drinking, and this is also a nice pathway directly of linking isotope-enabled models with these paleoclimate model simulations. Okay, and what we didn't discuss in great detail is there are different types of resolutions in our climate models. The low resolution run, and we can also do very high resolution simulations. Here you can see a simulation of hurricanes for marine isotopes stage 5E and 5D, so 125 and 115,000 years ago, the different categories and how this changes, and this is conducted with a hurricane resolving global model at 25 kilometer resolution. So we can provide more information on regional scales with some of these paleo snapshot simulations, and that's very important to understand and interpret regional features, for instance in topographically complex regions. There is an entire field called paleotempestology. I think Shakespeare, right, The Tempest, is the idea that you can look at extreme storm events such as hurricanes or tropical cyclones in general from a modeling point of view, but also there are proxy data that focus particularly on some of the extreme events. Delta 18O in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico is considered to be a hurricane indicator rather than an annual mean rainfall indicator. So this opens another door because we're always looking at these climate habitat models in the sense of the typical bioclimate variables, and I think you showed 19 different variables that you can choose from. I mean, hopefully you don't do it with all of them, but none of them includes the extreme events. How often do you have an extreme flood, like once in 100 years or once in 1,000 years? So these are data that haven't been fully utilized yet in these habitat models, and this is also important to understand some of the speleotherm data. If your cave has been dry in Morocco or in the Arabian Peninsula for a very long time, and then you just have one extreme rainfall event so large that the entire vadose layer can be filled with water and you have drips for a while and the speleotherm growth. So this is a new kind of a realm of climatic statistics that we should tap into. All right, Earth system models. Well, we talked about vegetation models, Elke. Hydrological models, this is actually something that really, I come back to that, but that really is lagging very far behind in the typical IPCC type of climate model. We don't have interactive hydrological models included, except very simple river runoff models. Ice sheet models, so Ricarda talked about ice sheet models, and also Ralph. So they are also not yet fully integrated and coupled to the typical climate models. They run offline, and we make certain assumptions about it. And I asked Bumsun about the integrated assessment models. This is a new it's not new, but it's an important area where, for the Anthropocene research, we are combining climate models with economic models, with human decision-making models, and all of this in one loop, and that gives us some ideas about the scenarios. We can calculate CO2 emissions even from that. So this is an interesting idea that can be further used to understand early Anthropocene questions, such as land use change by early farmers and so on. Yeah, the big problem is, even though we have end of time, this sounds like a James Bond movie, but anyways, the dynamic vegetation models, even though the word is used, very few of them are actually really dynamic. So you don't have propagation of vegetation zones, you don't have seed dispersal by squirrels, you don't have seed dispersal by insects, and so on. So these are pretty much habitat type of models. Plant functional types are determined by the available climatic conditions. But in reality, if you burn down a forest, it depends on what seeds are there, what comes out next. So this multiple, and that can create multiple equilibria and much more complicated dynamics, which can also lead to more fragmented landscape solutions. Okay, but the real scary thing is that if we look at the present-day deserts, which during orbital precessional minima would have been much wetter, such as in the Arabian Peninsula with lots of lakes and rivers and so on. This cannot be simulated by climate models right now. They don't have models that generate new rivers. They don't have models that generate large mega lakes, like Lake Chad, we heard about it from Gilles, or Lake Makharik. So dynamic hydrological models are not really coupled into our typical climate models, and that's will make it very, very difficult to use these models actually, except in a maybe a two-tier way in assessing potential areas for human occupation in what is now a desert, what used to be maybe a savanna way back. Okay, so there is an unreliability of climate models in these desert regions. That's something to consider, and that's something to resolve for climate modelers. Okay, I just wanted to say something about the Zimov manifesto. Is anybody familiar with the Pleistocene Park? Okay, Tom, of course, and Mika, okay. I mean, if you don't know anything about it, Google it. This is absolutely amazing. So Zimov and Zimov, they developed this, I don't know, manifesto. You can say they created large parks in Siberia where they have actually Pleistocene megafauna roam around, and they have areas nearby without that Pleistocene megafauna, and they're actually demonstrating the importance of megafauna in creating vegetation patterns and so on and so forth. So in principle, we can forget about vegetation models unless we have mammal models, megafauna models fully integrated in this, and the grazing is an important factor. And Dan Zhu mentioned it briefly, and Tushara Venugopal as well. So we have mammal models available still in the early stages, but eventually we want to couple them also to the vegetation models. That's important. Okay, human modeling, well, we introduced the direct statistics, ELCA's direct linkage between just where fossil sites were and the vegetation statistics. Then we can build more statistical models, interpolation models, habitat models. There are different types. Agent-based models, Christoph introduced this a lot. Density-based models, Mika Talavera gave a talk also focusing on these ones. And then you can have hybrid models, and that's a new idea where essentially the habitat estimation, habitat suitability becomes part of the carrying capacity of a density-based model, so reaction diffusion model. And we have machine learning, of course, everywhere nowadays. Okay, what do we want to model? Well, maybe many things. Right now, modeling human density, I think we made some progress with this one. Modeling culture, whatever culture is, how you define it, as a booster of carrying capacity, that would be the cultural carrying capacity. Or maybe you have to have different definitions, that's still opening. Modeling evolution, we didn't have any talk actually about modeling evolution. Nobody is using evolutionary models where you have selection of the fittest and where you have a fitness function and so on. They're mathematically possible, but computationally extremely expensive. Well, modeling behavior, changes in the rules of agents, is something that hasn't been fully considered yet, and maybe we are just in the infancy there. And then listening to Chiara's talk, I was wondering, can we come up with a concept or mathematical concept for language? I'm not sure how to do it, but that's maybe something for you on your flight back to figure out. Well, we have lots of interesting challenges here. One of the things I wanted to mention is also right now the agents in these agent-based models, they are simple. If you like to call them this way, they're also stupid because they don't make important decisions about keeping a family together and so on. So I asked Christoph the question about atoms versus molecules or macromolecules. Right now we are simulating atoms, not the molecules, families or bands or hordes, whatever you are looking at. So this is an interesting field that will develop, I think, in the next years, looking at the weak and strong emergence, and that can go back to modeling behavior, essentially. Why do we do that? Because a group will likely be much more efficient in creating new culture, boosting its own carrying capacity. And this is something to further figure out. Okay, I can't read that, this is all scrambled up. And let's go to the last slide here. Well, I mentioned already earlier on this possibility that we have not discussed in this conference much, the possibility that pathogens can actually play an important role in human extinctions or mammal extinctions. So there is an interesting case where around 200,000 years ago, in southern Africa most likely, hepatitis B and C and varicella zoster chickenpox essentially jumped over from animals, their zoonotic diseases, to humans. And then you can imagine, okay, these guys had about 160,000 years time to build up some immunity to these particular pathogens. And then Homo sapiens enters Neanderthal land with a good immunity, but also carrying these diseases because they have jumped over to humans already. And then they enter essentially these they meet these innocent Neanderthals. They're sitting around the fireplace and talking story. And what happens silently is essentially a killer gets transmitted over to them, which would be varicella zoster or hepatitis C. Requires a bit more body exchange. But this is something that we haven't really discussed. So there is an entire new field that we could develop, which is a bit more going into paleo diseases and their effect on human and mammal evolution. So that's maybe something for the future. Okay, so just a few words on the next item on our schedule. This is the collaboration or synergy cafe, and I think Yujong will say a few more words about it later on. I want to these are just some ideas about subjects that we could have. So I will just read them and then we go through them once more, and you just show me whether you're interested in participating. Just show me your hand maybe twice. Each one has 2 votes, okay? And then we can see if we can assemble these different groups. Okay, first group is going to be, maybe I should say, if you don't like these subjects, we have the group Free Roamers, where you are just being fed with good coffee and snacks out there, and you can have free discussions, pick your main or the person you always wanted to talk to for the next big project or for the next paper, or if just bugging the person because if you don't, that you didn't understand their talk. So that this is the Free Roamer group. And then I will give a little tutorial, if anybody is interested, in how to access climate model data from our 3 million year simulation, just on your Windows computer or laptop computer, if you have one with you, if that's of any interest. So then we start at the top. We can have potentially a cave group, cave people, climate reconstructions from caves, dating anthropology, archaeology, so this would be the cave nerd group. And I can imagine there might be some people there already. Genomics, where we can have more in detail discussion, where maybe also the genomics students from Seoul National University can ask other genomic experts here in the field some questions. Also, this is possible. Ancestry and languages. And we have, I think, a rather large group of people who are interested in Asian populations, and in particular Denisovans. So that's a possibility that we have one discussion group on Denisovans or what. The other one would be hydroanthropology of the desert. I was thinking about Mike's talk there because, I mean, you mentioned 350 caves in Arabian Peninsula and many sites, many paleo lakes. I mean, this is Mecca. Not directly, but Mecca for anthropologists and climate scientists. Really exciting. Then we can have another discussion on crossroads, which would be, let's say, something like Armenia, where different groups came together, had habitat overlap, maybe interbreeding, maybe competition, cultural exchanges, and so on. Earth system modeling, we can have a discussion on the role of vegetation and ice. Hominid modeling, if you want to know more about what are these models, you can ask potential experts from these fields, or if you have a specific idea that you want to simulate the hour ox in northwestern Morocco through the time of the last glacial cycles, this might be a group to hang out in. Human evolution in general, pathogens, immunity, we haven't talked about it, but if you find this is interesting, we can create a little group there. And then human agency, which is, cultural evolution, and how does cultural evolution shape our planet, which is more in the direction of Anthropocene. Okay, so these are all the groups. Let's start maybe with the free roamers. Who would like to be a free roamer? Okay, just keep your hands up. I just want to get an overview. Okay.
I can do multiple, right?
You can do multiple. Okay, so we will have number 11. Can somebody take a note of this? Sumin or Jenny, maybe just make a note. 11, yes. Climate model tutorial, anybody? Okay, enough people. Let's do that. So 10, yes. Let's go to number 1. 1, yes. Oh, that's only one hand, Nitesh. Okay, we're gonna do 1. Genomics ancestry. We have, once more, your hands up. 2 people only. 3, okay, oh no, it's coming up. Okay, genomics ancestry it is. Asian populations. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. Okay, do it. Hydroanthropology of the desert. Okay, you guys can talk anyways, just send each other emails. Okay, crossroads. Anybody? Okay, not. Oh, Gilles and okay, Ayakudu. Okay, I think we can do crossroads. All right, good. So 5 it is. Earth system modeling. Okay, all right. We do everything here. That's good. 6 we do. Hominin modeling. Also fine. Okay, human evolution. You only have two votes, right? Human evolution, pathogens. Okay, let's drop that. No enthusiasm. Human agency. Okay, we drop only 2. No, not really. Okay, that's okay. Good. We have, except for 8 and 9, we have everything. So we will maybe have little. How do we do that? You, John, do you have any idea how we are going to organize that? Maybe put some sheets out with these names. So keep in mind the number of the group that you want, and we put out on the 11th floor where we're going to meet. We put out some prints with a number, and you can assemble there, and you can also go to other groups as well, and there will be coffee, snacks, and juice, and also maybe also some cake, I think. So we'll go up there right now, I suppose. Yeah, and before we go up there, I wanted to say a big thanks to all the really important people in this room, so the ICCP staff members, and in particular Yu Jong, who has done a lot of work. Big round of applause to Yu Jong. Kyung-son standing in the back. Kyung-son waving there. Jenny, Sumin, Woojin, and Hemi, I think, is outside right now. And also a big thanks again to CPMG. It's always a pleasure to work with you guys.